Hello everybody, and welcome back again to another exciting episode of Clown World, only on Edge of Wonder TV. I'm your host, Benjamin Towles, and on today's exhilarating episode, we're going to be taking a look at something called the phantom time gap hypothesis. Dun dun dun. And essentially, what this theory talks about is that giant chunks of time, maybe 300 years or more, chunk at a time, from the historical record, the official historical record, are actually entire fabrications that never took place and only existed to push ahead the official dates of things. So for example, the Holy Roman Empire, the Pope Sylvester II, and possibly the Byzantine Emperor Constantine all fabricated the start of Anno Domini, aka AD. We have, BC, 200 BC, before Christ, and then we have AD, Anno Domini, and they have it set up just so conveniently that they're placed, the Holy Roman Empire, at the special year of AD 1000. And so to legitimize Otto's claim to the Holy Roman Empire, they believe that they altered, misrepresented, they changed forgeries of documentation and physical evidence, and the entire Carolingian period, the entire figure of Charlemagne himself, is an alleged entire fabrication, just used to push ahead the narrative. Now that's preposterous, right? That's not even possible. You couldn't even get away with doing that. Nobody could get away with doing something like that. That's a conspiracy theory. Well, it is definitely a conspiracy theory. But people definitely could get away with that. They could probably get away with that today, even though it would be very, very hard. But just imagine, back then, we're talking about peasants. The average person today, like you, if you're watching this video, you probably are more, you probably relate more to a nobleman of the old day because they actually had somewhat access to education. We really take it for granted how much the average peasant has access to in today's world. Like, I'm obviously a peasant. You're probably a peasant. I don't know, maybe kings and nobles watch this show. Maybe corporate execs and CEOs are watching this. But I'm a peasant. I'm just a dude. I don't even have a washing machine. But I do have access to the internet and to cars and to things, clothes, showers, social media. I can do all this crazy stuff. I can look up information whenever I want. I can find stuff. I can go to the library. The average peasant back then, 1,000 years ago, no. They probably didn't know, up from down. They probably, like, when the sky turned a different color than blue, they were probably just like, what? When it snowed, they were just like, what's this sticky stuff? It's gross. I'm just saying the average peasant back then was probably pretty gullible. Probably pretty simple-minded. Meaning that you could get away with just telling them stuff. Like, for example, if you had an entire population of peasants and you, like an entire generation, and then that generation kind of died off, and then another like their kids came up, and then the new generation of peasants, and you're the king, you've been ruling over this, and you've never once, that there's no public schooling in your kingdom, so like all these kids, they don't know, like you don't know what they've been told, but they don't know anything. You could just grab those kids and just start telling them, all right, peasants, we're going to now do official education on the history of the empire, the history of the kingdom. And then that would become the quote-unquote official version of what happened. Because those people, those peasants, wouldn't readily have access to all the antiquated information that would tell them whether or not these stories are true. They're just being told by mages or priests in high towers. Anytime you have somebody who has an assumed authority of truth, a fact checker, if you will, we all know how well fact checkers are respected in this day and age. So imagine how much they were respected back then when there was no alternative. Like today's world, you could just say like, man, forget that. I'm gonna be a Twitch streamer, and I don't care if I never get big. I'm gonna eat snacks and play video games all day. And you could do that. You could escape from society and go do that. No one's really gonna stop you. It's not even that expensive, to get Wi-Fi, to computer, to do all that. Not even really. But back then, if you lived in a kingdom, like you're not just gonna, hey, I'm gonna take a trip to Italy. No, you're not. You're not going on vacation. Your family needs you. Not only that, you need your family. Not only that, the family needs the kingdom, and the kingdom needs the family. It's like there was so little social mobility back then because of technology, the lack of anything, and the need for survival. And I'm really just hammering this point in because I really want you to understand that these people were pretty dumb. They were pretty stupid. But as you can imagine, this idea of the phantom time gap probably didn't gain a lot of traction within the mainstream academic sources. In fact, if you go to the Wikipedia page, they take the entire theory, they attribute it to one man, and then they spend the first paragraph trying to talk crap about that one guy. That's the typical way that you would suppress information or character assassinate. Classic Wikipedia. But let's look at some of his ideas and the reasoning behind why the phantom time gap theory even exists at all. So it's attributed to a Bavarian-born man named Heribert Illig. So one of the main first problems with history is that we use tests that maybe aren't the most accurate, but we all claim that they're very accurate, and then we base all of our information about what to do about that based on inaccurate tests. Now, there's no way that a population of people would ever try to base large decisions off of inadequate tests. There's no way that tests that aren't accurate could possibly be used to... I know, that's a stupid COVID joke. But anyways, the point is that our dating technologies that date archaeological artifacts or trees or whatnot, they're not the most precise. They're not as precise as they claim to be. Is the allegation, is the alleged allegation. Take it all with a grain of salt. Maybe there is no phantom time gap. But if you've never heard of a phantom time gap, it's a fascinating idea, and that alone makes it worth discussion in Clown World.
So if you'd like a visual on what it is that I'm talking about, it's probably a bit confusing, but we can take a famous biblical story, for example, like the walls of Jericho. And when people imagine the story of the walls of Jericho, where they had to march around the city blowing trumpets and the walls came down, they imagine something like this, usually. Very Middle Easternish, sandy, primitive-looking biblical times. However, if you look into the medieval times, they have lots and lots of paintings, manuscripts, and etchings of the story of the walls of Jericho, except in their versions, it's a medieval time period, as you can see from these. It's the same story, the same trumpets, the same walls coming down, the same battle. Like this painting, for example, is incredible. Look at how modern Jericho looks in this depiction. And all this is really is just an example of the possibilities of the phantom time gap theory. That biblical events may actually be a lot closer to right now than you realize. Here's an etching, and you can just again look at the architecture, look at the structures. There's the trumpets, there's the ark. All the story pieces are here, but typically people imagine it very swords and sandals, if you will, very biblical. So I just think that's a really cool story to check out.
The second basis of his hypothesis includes the idea of all these Romanesque architectures in the 10th century Western Europe. Why is there so much Roman architecture all over Europe, all over the world even? And the suggestion is that the Roman Empire didn't actually end that long ago, that the Roman Empire was actually a lot closer to modern times than we realize. Now this theory goes right in there with mud flood and Tartarian. It's right up that alley. It's talking about the same things, the same curiosities, the same questions, and then just inferring a different sort of mechanism took place. And funny enough, the official medievalists, that's not a word, medievalists, that sounds about right. The official medievalists actually called all this work pseudo-history, which is such a great term, pseudo-history. History is already his story, so history is already not even the most reliable source of information, and then to call it pseudo-history, it's like, wow, you're going to make a dude's version of events even less reliable than it already is? It seems silly to me. But let's look at it with a reasonable, logical approach. Now, the idea that 300 years of history was completely fabricated to push ahead the time, that's a big claim. I understand, that's a big claim. But do you think it's possible that the victor of a battle would perhaps write down in the historical record that their enemy's forces were actually much greater than they really were, thus making their victory a bigger deal? Do you think something like that could take place? Some sort of exaggeration of events? Of course. I would bet a lot of money that took place. We already can establish that people adjust the narrative to their own benefit. The question is, how far? With the extreme being that over 300 years have been shifted. Now, what are the ramifications of this theory? What are the implications? What is this? How does this all boil down to the big picture? The big picture is that the Roman Empire may have been 300 years closer to modern times than we realize. And that a lot of these fantastical events of history with Charlemagne coming out and Constantine and the switching, God came to me before this big battle and we have to switch to the cross. Now we're the Holy Roman Empire and we won the battle because I did that for God. Anytime you see something like that happen, where that story clearly gives the Holy Roman Empire, clearly gives the Catholic Church a lot of power and to convince, it's a piece of propaganda. You know, Constantine and the Dream, and Charlemagne, all those are just pieces of propaganda. Whether they happen or not is irrelevant to the idea that they're being used to convince everybody in the population to believe in one thing or another. If you can convert an entire population of an empire as big as Rome from a polytheistic religion to a monotheistic religion, that is no short feat. That is very, very impressive, if that's possible at all. Within, because they didn't just it wasn't like over the span of hundreds of years Rome became monotheistic. No, it was like an instantaneous moment in the record when it's like, nope, we're shifting. And the story of where it shifts is so fantastical that you gotta question. That's a pretty convenient story. And if you wanted to convert an entire population of people who were relatively dim-witted, not by their fault, they just didn't know what was happening, you could create these events and then start telling everybody that that's what happened. And tell them that they already are in the new paradigm. And that people looking around might be like, yeah, okay, well 300 years ago we had to do this thing. And then we did that thing, so now we're all this. Yeah, that makes sense. So you can, again, see how this episode relates a lot back to the Orphan Train episode, where it's just all about what mechanism are people using to rewrite history. And creating phantom time gaps is one of the most perfect mechanisms you could come up with. So a relevant point to all of this is the idea of grudges. It's unfortunate, but grudges are a real part of human behavior. And societies as a whole, and large powers, superpowers, hold grudges just the same as individuals do. So time is the healer, is the ultimate healer of all wounds. You know, time. If you get angry with someone, angry at your friend, just spend time away from them and you might start to miss them, etc. Just time heals. And so the idea is that some of these past events, major battles between giant forces that are still around today, some of those events might not be as old as we realize, and that the grudges might actually be fresher and more invigorated than we're told. You guys remember when Blackwater got in trouble for being, contract killers and mercenaries, and so they just rebranded and changed their name from Blackwater to something else? And they kept doing exactly what they were doing. Yeah, like that, but applied to an entire country and 300 years of history. It's very possible, or at least plausible, that in the past, a super evil power won a war, and then they knew they weren't very popular, so they just convinced everybody that they were the other people the whole time. Another aspect of this theory that I think I touched on in a previous episode is the idea of how history was recorded back then. There'd be mages or monks in a castle or at a monastery, and they'd be given old texts because they were the only ones who could read, and they could read Greek, and so they would translate from Greek to Latin or Latin to English, etc. And so these mages, working independently from each other in all these different castles all across Europe, they would be coming up with all these old manuscripts that people gave them, these old scrolls. There'd be hundreds of them in all these different places, working independently. They're reading this and they read about, okay, this historian, maybe the page is ripped. This historian says there was a flood at this date, okay, and then there was a major battle right afterwards, okay. And then they find another scroll that talks about, and in this year, 300 years later, there was also a flood and then a big major battle. And so the mage then assumes that those are two separate events. So the mage then, one piecing together the timeline, creates two separate events. And then not realizing that both of these scrolls, despite appearing to be from different times, were actually describing the same event. So if you combine this theory with the orphan train theory and the ideas of the mud flood, you can essentially get down to the point of even things like Greek gods and Jesus and the time of the Bible, those could be 250 years away from modern history today. Now, the idea of Jesus being that close, or Zeus or somebody being that close to today's world, that is a profound idea. In today's world, when we think about Jesus or Zeus or the old times, it's so far away, it's so distant, it just appears like it just isn't relevant because it's so far away. But with the phantom time gap theory, and if you combine that with the orphan train and the mud flood theory, you can start to get this idea that perhaps some of those things didn't happen that long ago. And perhaps the ramifications of those, the grudges held from those events, are still being played out today in front of our faces. But just using different names, different obscurities, different covers, different disguises, different rebrandings. I mean, an example of this that we all sort of feel is if you were a kid growing up in maybe the 90s, you were probably taught about Christopher Columbus discovering America. Then you go on maybe to middle school, and then you start to learn that, no, actually, he didn't discover it, Amerigo Vespucci did. Oh, actually, then Leif Erikson did. Well, actually, the Chinese had already. Well, actually, the Viking. And so you can see how even in our own basic understanding of history, it's constantly being readjusted. Like, Pluto's a planet. Pluto's not a planet anymore. Stuff like that constantly is coming out. So if they could do that at any moment, who's to say that they couldn't do that for big moments? Who's to say that right now, at this exact precise time, we have everything understood? It's so implausible. It's just unlikely that right now, we have everything perfectly figured out. No. Don't think so. Don't think you do. So that's the phantom time gap theory. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can apply this and find so many different rabbit holes that you can then approach. So, as always, take everything you hear with a grain of salt. You know, this is just theories. These are just fun mental exercises to keep your brain young and fresh. Be a good person. Stay vigilant. Call your mom. Peace.